February 9th, 1945, 14:35 hours. Paco District, Manila, Philippines. Staff Sergeant Thomas Murphy of the 1st Cavalry Division pressed himself against a shell-pocked wall as machine gun fire tore through the air 3 feet above his head. Brick fragments showered down from the impacts. Behind him, his squad waited for the firing to stop, and beyond them, trapped in a burning apartment building, were the screams. Not soldiers screaming. Civilians. Women and children who'd been sheltering in that building for days, maybe weeks, while the Battle of Manila consumed the city around them. Now the building was on fire from Japanese incendiary rounds, and the people inside were dying. "Sarge, we can't get to them!" Corporal James Rodriguez shouted over the gunfire. "That Nambu has the whole street covered." Murphy looked at the burning building, at the windows where desperate faces appeared and disappeared through the smoke, at the machine gun position that commanded the approaches. The tactical decision was obvious. Bypass the building. Continue the advance. Let the fire take whoever was inside. You couldn't save everyone. This was war. But Murphy was looking at children's faces in those windows, and the tactical decision became impossible to make. "Wilson, Henderson, get that bazooka up here," Murphy ordered. "Rodriguez, you're on smoke grenades. We're taking out that Nambu, and then we're getting those people out." 3 minutes later, the machine gun position was a smoking crater. Smoke grenades obscured the street, and Murphy was running through fire toward a burning building, while 8 American soldiers followed him into hell because there were civilians who needed saving more than they needed to survive the next 10 minutes tactically. They kicked down the apartment building's door and found 47 Filipino civilians huddled in a ground-floor room filling with smoke. Mothers clutching babies, elderly who could barely walk, children who'd stopped crying because they'd used up all their tears days ago. The civilians stared at the American soldiers with expressions that mixed terror with desperate hope, not sure whether these armed men were liberators or just different killers. "We're Americans!" Murphy shouted, though he had no idea if any of them spoke English. "We're getting you out! Follow us! Now!" They didn't need translation. Within seconds, American soldiers were carrying children, supporting elderly, guiding families through the smoke-filled hallway, while the building groaned and cracked from the fire consuming its upper floors. They made 3 trips, soldiers running into a burning building again and again because there were more people who needed carrying, more children who couldn't walk fast enough, more elderly who'd collapse without support. On the final trip out, as Murphy was helping an old woman who could barely breathe through the smoke, part of the ceiling collapsed behind them. The woman looked at Murphy, this American soldier who'd just risked his life to save hers, and began crying so hard she couldn't walk. Murphy picked her up, carried her outside, and set her down gently on the sidewalk where medics were already treating the evacuees. The woman grabbed Murphy's hand with surprising strength and spoke rapidly in Tagalog, words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was unmistakable. She was thanking him for her life, for her family's lives, for remembering that they were human beings worth saving, even though saving them meant running into burning buildings under fire. The city became hell. Manila, in early February 1945, had transformed from the Pearl of the Orient into an urban battlefield where Japanese forces had decided to make their final stand, despite General Yamashita's orders to abandon the city. Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commanding approximately 16,000 Japanese naval troops, chose to defend Manila to the death, turning the city into fortress, where every building became a defensive position and every street a killing ground. The decision to fight in Manila guaranteed civilian catastrophe. The city held approximately 700,000 civilians who had nowhere to evacuate as battle lines formed around them. Japanese forces commandeered buildings for defensive positions, often with civilians still inside. American forces advancing to liberate the city had to fight through urban terrain, where every assault risked civilian casualties, where artillery and air support would inevitably kill innocents alongside enemy soldiers. The scale of urban warfare that developed exceeded anything American forces had experienced in the Pacific. The fighting in Manila from February 3 to March 3, 1945, involved house-to-house combat through a modern city where approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians would die. More civilian deaths than American forces would suffer in combat casualties during the entire Philippine campaign. Approximately 16,000 civilians were killed deliberately by Japanese forces through massacres and atrocities. Another 84,000 died from artillery fire, collapsing buildings, starvation, disease, and the general catastrophe of having a major city become a battlefield. By battle's end, 80% of Manila's buildings were damaged or destroyed, leaving hundreds of thousands homeless, even after liberation. The Americans advancing into Manila in early February understood they were fighting not just to defeat Japanese forces, but to save whatever civilian population could survive the battle. The dual mission, destroy enemy forces while minimizing civilian casualties and rescuing trapped populations, created tactical complications that slowed American advance and increased American casualties, but reflected values that insisted civilians were worth protecting even at military cost. The advance through fire. American forces pushing into Manila district by district encountered tactical nightmare where Japanese defenses were deliberately positioned to maximize civilian casualties. Japanese forces fortified hospitals, schools, churches, and residential buildings, ensuring that American forces couldn't assault positions without risking civilians. Booby traps were placed in areas where civilians might seek shelter. Artillery was directed at refugee columns attempting to escape combat zones. The American response was to advance more slowly and carefully than tactical efficiency would dictate, accepting increased risk to American forces in exchange for reduced civilian casualties. Infantry assaulted fortified buildings using small arms and grenades rather than calling in artillery that would collapse structures with civilians inside. Armor supported infantry advances but held fire when civilians were visible. The systematic prioritization of civilian safety over tactical speed meant the Battle of Manila took nearly a month when aggressive use of firepower might have ended it in days. Private First Class Eugene Henderson, advancing through Ermita District with the 37th Infantry Division, described the tactical complications. Every building could have Japanese soldiers, civilians, or both. We'd approach a position expecting to fight, find civilians inside, have to secure them while still under fire from other positions. Sometimes Japanese would fire from buildings with civilians in them, forcing us to assault with extreme caution. We took casualties because we couldn't just blow up every building that might have enemies. We had to clear them carefully because there might be families hiding inside. The systematic care taken to avoid civilian casualties stood in stark contrast to Japanese conduct. Japanese forces throughout the battle used civilians as human shields, positioned defensive positions deliberately to maximize civilian exposure to American fire, and conducted massacres of civilians in occupied districts. The contrast between American efforts to minimize civilian deaths and Japanese willingness to maximize them couldn't have been starker. The rescue operations begin. As American forces secured districts, they immediately encountered thousands of civilians who'd been trapped without food, water, or medical care for days or weeks. The civilians were in desperate condition, starving, dehydrated, wounded from shelling and building collapses, traumatized by weeks of terror. The immediate humanitarian crisis demanded response that military units weren't structured to provide. but that American personnel improvised immediately. Combat soldiers became rescue workers, carrying civilians from danger zones to relative safety behind American lines. Medics treated civilian casualties alongside military wounded, often prioritizing civilians whose injuries were more severe. Field kitchens fed civilian populations using rations intended for troops. The humanitarian operations happened without formal orders or established procedures. Individual soldiers and units made decisions to help because the need was overwhelming, and the alternative was letting civilians die. The physical condition of rescued civilians shocked American personnel who'd fought across the Pacific but hadn't seen civilian populations subjected to prolonged urban warfare. Many civilians showed signs of severe malnutrition from weeks without adequate food. Dehydration was universal. Water supplies had been cut off or contaminated. Wounds from shrapnel, building collapses, and burns were common and often infected from lack of medical care. Children were particularly affected, showing the hollow-eyed appearance of prolonged starvation and trauma. Corporal James Rodriguez, who participated in rescuing civilians from Paco District, documented the conditions. They were living in cellars and ruins, surviving on whatever they could find. Some hadn't eaten in 3 or 4 days. Children were so weak they couldn't walk. Elderly were dying from dehydration and neglect. When we brought them out and gave them water and food, many just broke down crying. Some couldn't believe we were helping them. They'd been abandoned so long they'd stopped expecting rescue. The hospital massacres. The liberation of Manila's hospitals revealed the full extent of Japanese atrocities against civilian populations. Japanese forces occupying hospitals had systematically murdered patients, staff, and civilians seeking shelter. The massacres at Red Cross headquarters, Philippine General Hospital, and other medical facilities documented deliberate targeting of helpless civilians that violated every standard of warfare. At Philippine General Hospital, which American forces liberated on February 10th, they found evidence of mass killings. Approximately 500 patients, doctors, nurses, and civilians who'd sought shelter there had been murdered by Japanese forces before American arrival. The hospital buildings showed signs of deliberate arson. Bodies were found with bayonet wounds, evidence of execution-style killings, and signs of atrocities that went beyond military necessity into pure massacre. The discoveries hardened American resolve to rescue remaining civilian populations before Japanese forces could murder them. The hospital massacres demonstrated that Japanese forces weren't simply fighting a defensive battle, they were conducting systematic atrocities against helpless civilians. The urgency of rescue operations increased as American forces realized that time was measured not just in military terms, but in how many civilians could be saved before Japanese forces killed them. Captain Robert Morrison, whose company helped secure Philippine General Hospital, described the scene. "We'd seen combat casualties throughout the war, but this wasn't combat. This was murder. Patients in hospital beds who'd been bayoneted. Nurses who'd been killed while trying to protect their patients. Civilians who'd thought a hospital would be safe and were slaughtered there. The systematic cruelty was shocking even to men who'd fought for 2 years in the Pacific. It made us even more determined to reach civilians before Japanese forces could murder them." The Intramuros Siege. The battle for Intramuros, Manila's historic walled city, represented the most intense period of civilian rescue operations under fire. Japanese forces had fortified Intramuros's thick Spanish colonial walls and historic buildings, turning the district into fortress. Approximately 4,000 civilians were trapped inside with the defending forces, unable to escape through the walls that had been built centuries earlier to protect the city but now served as prison. American forces faced impossible tactical choice: assault Intramuros aggressively and risk massive civilian casualties, or approach cautiously and extend the battle while trapped civilians died from starvation, shelling, and Japanese atrocities. The decision was to use massive firepower to breach walls and suppress Japanese defenses, then send infantry to fight through the interior while trying to locate and rescue civilians. The assault on Intramuros, beginning February 17th, was the most intense urban combat of the Manila battle. Artillery pounded the walls for days, creating breaches for infantry assault. The bombardment was necessary to reduce Japanese defenses, but inevitably killed civilians trapped inside. American forces then fought building to building through Intramuros's narrow streets, searching for civilians while engaging Japanese forces determined to fight to the death. The civilian toll in Intramuros was catastrophic. Of approximately 4,000 civilians trapped inside when the assault began, perhaps 3,000 died during the 9-day battle from artillery, building collapses, Japanese massacres, and the general chaos of combat. The survivors rescued by American forces were traumatized, starving, and wounded. Many had watched family members die. All had experienced horrors that exceeded human capacity to process. Private Eugene Henderson participated in clearing Intramuros and rescuing survivors. We'd clear a building, find Japanese soldiers dead or fighting, and then hear crying from a cellar or hidden room. We'd find families who'd been hiding for days while battle raged above them. Some thought we were Japanese coming to kill them and would try to hide. Others rushed out desperate for rescue. Every building we cleared might have people needing saving, so we had to search carefully, even when doing so exposed us to fire from positions we hadn't cleared yet. The medical crisis. The medical challenges of treating tens of thousands of civilian casualties exceeded anything American medical personnel had encountered. The casualties weren't primarily combat wounds. They were starvation, dehydration, disease, crush injuries from building collapses, burns from fires, and trauma-related conditions that required different treatment than battlefield injuries. The medical conditions were extensive and life-threatening. By mid-February 1945, American medical personnel treating rescued civilians found that approximately 40 to 50% showed signs of severe malnutrition, not just hunger, but dangerous weight loss that required careful refeeding protocols. Dehydration was nearly universal among civilians who'd been without clean water for days or weeks, with approximately 60 to 70% requiring intravenous fluids. Dysentery and other waterborne diseases affected an estimated 30 to 40% of rescued civilians due to contaminated water sources and unsanitary conditions during the siege. Respiratory infections were epidemic, affecting perhaps 50% of the civilian population from smoke inhalation, dust from collapsed buildings, and crowded sheltering conditions. Burns from fires were common, with approximately 15–20% of rescued civilians showing burn injuries ranging from minor to life-threatening. Wounds from shrapnel, building collapses, and other trauma affected an estimated 25 to 30%, many with infections from delayed treatment. American medical personnel established field hospitals that treated civilians alongside military casualties, often prioritizing civilian cases when they were more severe. The medical care provided to Filipino civilians used the same resources, techniques, and standards applied to American wounded. Blood plasma, antibiotics, surgical interventions, all were made available to civilians despite resource constraints. Captain Sarah Chen, an Army nurse working in a field hospital treating both military and civilian casualties, documented the medical challenges. We'd treat combat wounds on American soldiers, then turn to treating malnourished children, then back to military casualties. The civilian cases were often more heartbreaking because they'd suffered for so long before we could reach them. Children dying from starvation. Elderly dying from treatable wounds that had become infected. Women who'd been traumatized beyond what we could address with the resources available. We saved many, but we lost many too. People who would have survived if we'd reached them days or weeks earlier. The liberation's cost. By early March 1945, when organized Japanese resistance in Manila ended, the city lay in ruins, and approximately 100,000 Filipino civilians were dead. But American and Filipino forces had rescued tens of thousands who would have died without intervention, providing food, water, medical care, and protection that meant survival instead of death. The rescue operations came at significant cost. American forces suffered approximately 1,010 killed and 5,565 wounded during the month-long battle. Casualties increased by tactical decisions to prioritize civilian safety over aggressive use of firepower. The resources dedicated to humanitarian operations reduced supplies available for combat operations. The time taken to rescue civilians extended the battle beyond what might have been necessary with unrestricted warfare. But American forces maintained humanitarian operations throughout the battle because saving civilians was considered inherent to their mission rather than optional. The decision reflected values that insisted human life had worth regardless of nationality, that defeating enemies didn't mean abandoning civilians to die, that victory measured not just in military terms, but in lives saved. The gratitude that couldn't be contained. For Filipino civilians who'd been rescued from burning buildings, pulled from collapsed structures, evacuated under fire, and provided with food and medical care by American soldiers, the gratitude was overwhelming and immediate. They'd experienced 3 years of Japanese occupation brutality, followed by the horror of Manila's battle. The discovery that American forces were willing to risk their lives to save Filipino civilians created emotional responses that transcended normal expressions of thanks. The gratitude manifested in countless ways. Civilians who could barely walk would bow deeply to American soldiers. Mothers would press their children's hands into American soldiers' hands in gestures of trust and thanks. Elderly who'd lost everything would offer small gifts, religious medals, photographs, whatever they'd managed to preserve, to soldiers who'd saved them. The gifts weren't valuable materially, but represented everything the givers had left. Some expressions of gratitude went beyond words or gestures. Filipino civilians who'd been rescued volunteered to help American forces however they could, carrying supplies, guiding troops through ruined districts they knew, caring for wounded, assisting with humanitarian operations. The volunteer work wasn't requested or required, but emerged spontaneously from populations determined to contribute something in return for having their lives saved. Maria Santos, rescued with her 3 children from a burning building in Paco district, described her feelings. "The Americans ran into fire to save us. They didn't know us. We were strangers in a foreign city. But they risked their lives because we were human beings who needed help." How do you thank someone for your life, for your children's lives? Words aren't enough. I helped in their field hospital for months after liberation, caring for wounded soldiers and civilians because I needed to give something back for what they'd given us. The rebuilding begins. Even before Manila's battle ended completely, American forces began rebuilding efforts that would transition from emergency humanitarian relief to longer-term reconstruction. The work was complicated by ongoing combat in some districts, limited resources, and the overwhelming scale of destruction. The immediate priorities were water and sanitation. Engineers worked to restore water systems that would prevent disease spread. Sanitation facilities were established in camps and neighborhoods to reduce dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. The work was unglamorous, but critical for preventing post-battle epidemics that could kill thousands who'd survived combat. Food distribution was systematized beyond emergency feeding operations. American forces established distribution centers throughout Manila that provided rations to registered civilians. The system ensured everyone received adequate food while preventing chaos and black market diversion. By mid-March, American forces were feeding approximately 400,000 civilians daily in Manila through organized distribution networks. Medical care transitioned from emergency trauma treatment to addressing ongoing health needs. Field hospitals continued operating, but with focus shifting to treating disease, malnutrition, and chronic conditions rather than combat wounds. Public health campaigns addressed epidemic diseases, nutrition programs targeted vulnerable populations, and maternal and infant health services were established. The closing reality. The story of Filipino civilians crying when American soldiers risked their lives to rescue them from hell documented more than successful military liberation. It demonstrated that even in total war's chaos, systematic commitment to protecting civilian life remained possible for forces that valued human dignity above tactical efficiency. The American soldiers who ran into burning buildings to carry out civilians, who advanced more slowly to minimize civilian casualties, who shared their rations with starving families, who treated wounded Filipinos with the same medical care they'd give their own, all made choices that reflected values about human worth that transcended nationality and military necessity. For Filipino civilians who experienced the horror of Manila's battle and the mercy of American rescue operations, the contrast between Japanese conduct and American conduct couldn't have been starker. Japanese forces had used them as human shields, murdered them in hospitals, and left them to die in ruins. American forces had rescued them under fire, fed them from military rations, treated their wounded, and rebuilt systems that allowed survival.